Welcome, everyone. My name is Amanda Williams, and I'm joined today by Jim Zobel, and we are both historians here at the MacArthur Memorial. And several weeks ago, we had a discussion about the Admiralty Islands. Today, we're going to be talking about Hollandia and Aitape. April 1944, General MacArthur's forces make a 580-mile amphibious leap to seize airfields at Hollandia and Aitape in New Guinea. And it's a very, very bold plan. And it means making two simultaneous amphibious landings deep into enemy territory. And it was also the first time that Admiral Chester Nimitz's aircraft carriers supported a MacArthur assault. So this is a pretty important part of the island hopping story. And so that's what we're going to focus on today. So, Jim, we've talked about the Admiralties and how the seizure of the Admiralty Islands accelerates General MacArthur's campaign and Nimitz's campaign as well. So, how do the Japanese respond to the loss of the Admiralty Islands?
They really look to Wewak. Wewak Madang is the next in line up to from where the Australians and the Americans are moving west along New Guinea. You had the Americans land at Sidor in January. We had talked about that earlier. And that was where they had found that trunk that had all the code books in it. And so when you take the Admiralties, you've basically sealed off Rabaul. And so now that major air base that the Japanese have, where they have about 100,000 troops, they now realize they're secluded. They can't really go anywhere. They're surrounded. I mean, the Americans don't really have to attack them, but that base is basically out of the picture now. So now your main base for the Japanese that is still, active is that Wewak, Hansa Bay, Madang region. And that was where the Americans and the Australians were pushing up through New Guinea when they went up to the Admiralty Islands. So at Hansa Bay, Wewak, you've got this guy, Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi. He's got about 40,000 Japanese troops there. They think that that's where the next big battle is going to come from. But with the reason they had done the Admiralty's invasion under MacArthur's forces because they wanted to secure their back door to be able to go to Hollandia. So they had been planning that earlier on. After they took the Admiralties, the JCS finally gave them the approval, and so that's where they're planning on moving. So the Japanese are starting to move air fleets are trying to into Hollandia, which is about 300 miles west of that Hansa Bay region, or about 200 miles. And the thing is that the Americans know they're going to bring in air power, but there aren't that many troops there. There's only about 11,000 Japanese at Hollandia. And so they had planned to bypass, all those Japanese troops under Adachi at Hansa Bay Wewak. So the main thing is that the Japanese response to it after the Admiralty seizure is they're held at Hansa Bay Wewak because Americans are using a lot of deception plans to keep them there. Radio signals, bombing raids, just focusing on Hansa Bay Wewak and making the Japanese think that's where they're going to go. And so really the Japanese don't respond in a way that's going to prevent anything from happening at Hollandia. I think Adachi had been told to move a regiment of troops there, but had not gotten to that point but before the Americans land on the 22nd.
It's always interesting when we talk about the Pacific theater and everything's always thousands or hundreds of miles from each other. It's very
Right.
different, I think, than even the European theater where things are a little closer. And I think it makes people forget how complex some of these operations are. And when we're talking about a jump, we're not talking about, 60 miles this way, hundreds. It's amazing.
And I think it all has to do because the anchorages, where you can get into a deep water area. And so the next deep water area from Hansa Bay Wewak is Hollandia. And you're not gonna, and
Yeah.
you don't get to another deep water again until about Elvink Bay. So there's about I think a 300-mile stretch between those two, that
Okay.
that put this place, and so that's why these places are chosen. Like the Admiralties had that Seidler Harbor, which was so deep. Rabaul had one of the deepest harbors there was, Leh, Salamaua. So it kind of works out that way, where you can get ships into.
Okay. All right. So, all right. So we've talked about the Japanese. We've talked about kind of aftermath of admiralties. So, how does MacArthur respond? What is he thinking of Hollandia and Aitape? What is he wanting to accomplish there?
Well, it's all airfields. The whole campaign that MacArthur has going across is being able to cover the next amphibious move with land-based air power. So every place that he seizes, along with the Australians and the Americans, is to build that new air base there. And the Japanese have started a lot of these already, but the Japanese didn't have any tractors or any, everything was hand done by labor. Whereas the Americans can go in, they got 50 bulldozers, they got everything that can come in and turn places overnight. So Hollandia is really this air base that they want to grab. They think that the soil's going to be the best there. Hollandia has two landing beaches. You've got Humboldt on the east, and you've got Tanamera on the west side, where they want to move in. And then behind those on New Guinea is the Cyclops Mountains, which go to about 7,000 feet, and Lake Sentani. But there's this broad plain there that you can build airfields on, and that's where the Japanese have started. So everything really moves by that. Is where can you get troops ashore and start building airfields? And so they knew through that code breaking that they had very few troops there. I think at Hollandia you've got the 6th Air Division of the 4th Air Army of Japan. I forget the guy's name, but he runs that group there. And then you've got all these Japanese Second Army base troops that are there. So it comes out to about 11,000 troops that aren't really combat troops. They're more, airplane personnel and airfield, maintainers, things like that.
Now, in the intro, I mentioned that this is going to be one of MacArthur's, or the first MacArthur operation in which Admiral Nimitz's aircraft carriers provide support. Do MacArthur and Nimitz personally work out this cooperation? How does this come together?
Yeah, it's the first time they both get together. Nimitz brings his whole staff to Brisbane, Australia. Forrest Sherman and all his junior people that run the various fleets, because they're going to use Fifth Fleet under Spruance at this time, and they work it out where they'll give MacArthur 8 escort carriers to be able to work this as well. Spruance's main carriers, Task Force 58, those are going to do attacks on the Carolines and the Palau Islands to keep Japanese away from them. They're most worried about being in those coastal areas between New Guinea, Rabaul Island. They're worried about those carriers being in a position where they can be hit by land-based air power. And the big thing about those conferences in March at Brisbane is General Kinney of the 5th Air Force convincing Nimitz, as well as Mark Misher and all these Navy guys, that they can be able to go in and silence land-based air power, which they do. They wipe out everything at Hansa Bay. They wipe out everything at Hollandia. They've already taken care of the Admiralties. Rabaul is totally suppressed. They're doing flights to the west of Hollandia as well, and Kinney will be good to his word. The carriers won't have much to worry about at all when they go in there. But yeah, it's the first, and because it's such a long leap, that 580 miles, they wanted to have Nimitz's carriers on this to be able to help, and Nimitz was very gracious. Yeah, of course I'll help. And I think it's the first time that MacArthur and Nimitz get together and are really able to talk. They say it's a very like when MacArthur had met Halsey before, everything goes really good. I mean, they're not like buddy like Halsey and MacArthur will be, but Nimitz is totally professional, and totally a straight player, and that's what MacArthur likes about him.
Okay, so What's the plan then? How do the landings unfold?
Well, you've got the 24th Division that's going to go, that's under Frederick Irving. That's going to go in at Tanamera Bay, which is that western bay they can move in. And then Horace Fuller is going to go under the into Humboldt Bay. He's got the 41st Division. They'll start at Cape Cretin, which is on the Huon Peninsula, and then the 24th is down in Goodenough Island. So yeah, it's about 580 miles that these guys have to go by on these LSTs and LCVs and various convoy ships that they'll have. They go and they rendezvous up by the Admiralties, and then they're going to drive down. You've got this guy, Victor Crutchley's a British admiral, is going to have the Australia and the Shropshire under his bombardment group, Russell Berkey, Task Force 75, and then you'll have William Fechteller. He'll do the amphib invasions at by Hollandia, and then Barbie will do them at Aitape. So they both go in about the same time. One of those regimental combat teams from the 41st Division is going to go into Aitape under this guy Jens Doe, and it's all planned for the 22nd, and they do all the bombing by the 5th Air Force in the weeks before. They have a bombardment of the areas right when they go in, but really there's basically no resistance by the Japanese. I mean, they're taking some pot shots, but Humboldt Bay is seized immediately. MacArthur goes in there and walks the beach with Horace Fuller right out in the open, no problem. They go about a couple miles up, a couple miles back. Then he takes the Nashville over to Tanamera Bay. That's where Irving's landed. And when he goes ashore, Robert Eichelberger's there, who's commanding all those forces under First Corps. This was Eichelberger's first command since Buna. He had been kind of shunted to the background, where he then trained all the troops for all these invasions later on. And the thing is when they go into Tanamera Bay, they hadn't done a good job figuring out what was behind. And so you had all these swamps right behind Tanamera Bay, and you couldn't get troops in there. And they're going to shuffle most of them back to Humboldt Bay, about 25 miles to the east, to get them in. But MacArthur goes up to Eichelberger right there. And he's like, let's go to Wakdi, which is another few hundred miles to the west. It's a hard coral surface island that they can immediately take and put into service there. And MacArthur, goes right up to him and says, what do you want to do? This is your call. And Kruger's like, and 6th Army commander, he's there. Alamo Force, he's like, this is your call, Eichelberger. And Kenny's all for it. He's like, yep, we can't get him in here. Let's get him back on these transports. Let's move west. And Eichelberger's like, nope, not going to do it. And, Eichelberger doesn't get his 4th star, like Kruger does. And I think a lot of it comes from that. MacArthur was taking his measure of him. Can you be bold right now? Let's do this. That would have advanced the timetable by over, a month at least. But who knows what had happened? There really wasn't much of a force there under the Japanese, but anything could have happened. So I mean, you can't really fault Eichelberger. I mean, he's worried about his men, but that was not the way MacArthur saw it, I don't think. And so they all go back on the ship, and they all have chocolate sodas, except for MacArthur. And then MacArthur the next day will go to Aitape, where they've seized Taji Airdrome on the eastern side. And that's what's really facing Hatazo Adachi's troops at Wewak now, is that group at Aitape. And come a couple of months later in June, Adachi's going to move hundreds of miles through the jungle with all his forces and almost come to the point of taking Aitape back. It's one of the craziest episodes in the Southwest Pacific. I mean, the fact that this guy Adachi will move with his forces all the way through the jungle and get that close, without and come close to things. I mean, they'll handle it very well, and that'll be the end of it on the Jernamor River. But yeah, the Aitape place is something that will always stick out. Yeah.
Mhm. So operations conclude on June 6th, 1944.
That's about when that Jernamor River battle is in June. Yeah. I
So
mean, they didn't really have any problems until before then, but yeah.
Okay. So
Yeah.
that's kind of the end of that. That's
Yeah.
D-Day. It's also just a short time after Mark Clark has taken Rome.
Yeah.
So obviously the operation is a success. Um, how does that then play into the next stage of the war?
Well, it's everything for MacArthur. I mean, now he's got the power, the capability. He's got enough lift, that he can move troops to positions that he wants to. They're going to go into Wakti, Sarmi, Biak, Noamfor, Sansapor, all within the space of about 100 days. And Kruger's going to have, I think, 6 operations going on at once because MacArthur's just like, okay, let's move it. And whereas it took them, I think, and we've said this before, it took them like a couple of years just to get to the Huon Peninsula, only a few hundred miles from Buna. They're going to go now 1,500 miles in less than 100 days. And it really is what sets up the Philippines because everybody just sees, victory after victory, after Hollandia with very few losses because they're landing where the Japanese aren't. And that's going to be, a big factor in the push into the Philippines, really.
I always wonder, why do we not know more about these particular campaigns? People like to send it, and you're very well aware of this, but we get a lot of messages saying that, MacArthur had no talent. They'll give him the occupation of Japan, they'll give him Incheon, but pretty much blame him for everything else. So do you think that's because the campaigns through New Guinea and, to the Philippines are kind of complicated and, maybe geographically places that we're not really familiar with as Americans um, or do you just think that media coverage for a lot of what was happening there, particularly in New Guinea, is just overshadowed by, Clark's capture of Rome or, D-Day and things happening in Europe? What do you think about that?
I think it's a lot of different factors. I mean, you and I have talked. If you look at compendiums of World War II, you've got like 800 pages on Europe, and then you have like 20 pages on the Pacific. It's all Pearl Harbor and the bomb. No, I think you're right about the geographically challenged. I mean, in Europe, you know where London is. I mean, most people have a good idea of France and Italy and Spain and all these places everybody's heard of. Whereas in the Pacific, it's all green jungle. And I mean, in Europe, you have all these battles at Normandy and all around the Falaise Gap and trying to break out of the headdress where you're losing thousands and thousands and thousands of soldiers, and it's not happening in MacArthur's theater because they're bouncing around the Japanese. They're pulling off these lightning moves that land where the Japanese basically aren't. I mean, you got some problems at Biak, but nothing that's not taken care of in a few weeks. And as well, they're not liberating town after town, within France or within Italy. What you're doing is you're putting off these superhuman efforts, building air bases out of nothing. I mean, there's no dock. We've said it. There's no docks in New Guinea. There's no, roads in New Guinea. It's this engineers' war of logistics that's boring to most people, but if you understand it, from the perspective of generalship, then yeah, MacArthur's a genius. And Kinney even said it a lot of the time. There was no doctrine for any of this. It was all just, us being able to pull it off and make it happen. And even Admiral Kincaid said that these guys were the biggest bunch of horse thieves he had ever run into. It was like some kind of pirate show that they were pulling off, getting what they needed, getting the shipping they needed from everybody else, not giving it back, and then using it to make this march across New Guinea that nobody expected to happen. And so it's hard for people to understand because yes, there's no local land points that they understand. How many times have you heard Jayapura growing up in high school, or Finchhaven, or Rabaul? None.
Yeah.
But everybody knows the Battle of the Bulge, the Normandy invasion, we're moving into Germany, Antwerp, so
Mm. And
it's,
I'll
it's
admit,
got
I mean, as 15 years in, and I'm still going back to that big map that used to be outside my office just to make sure that I understand where is where. So I mean, I sympathize with the geography side of it, but I think you're
Well,
right.
I've watched a lot of podcasts of guys talking about MacArthur in the Pacific, and they don't even know it. They're putting one landing after the other. These guys are the experts. They don't even know what follows what. So
Yeah.
yeah, it is, but that's what makes it, to me, what makes it so interesting. Is these guys pull all this stuff off, and all these troops that are National Guard troops, they come through, for MacArthur. I mean, you got the first Cav, which is something special, and some of these other groups, but most of these National Guard guys, they're as good as anybody else. You know.
I've always thought too, had any one of these campaigns, any of these hops really failed, I've always thought that would have just been a shutdown of everything that they were trying to do over there for a while Europe continued to progress. I think there would have just been a hard stop. It's not working. Time out. Let's figure out Europe, and then we'll get to this in another couple years, maybe. I do think
Yeah,
that would have happened.
I think so. I mean, the Navy was really for the Central Pacific drive. They King wanted to shut down MacArthur every second. And so I think, that there's a lot to that. If they had some big slaughter, on the beach, that might have changed things, at least in MacArthur's theater. I mean, you look at Tarawa, Palelu, all these Navy Marine things, Iwo Jima and all that, they were the worst, but
Hmm. All right. Final thoughts before we close.
yeah, everybody sign up for the newsletter because we've put maps of all these places, pictures of all these places. So if you do the Admiralties as well as the Hollandia podcast, you'll have a way to look at where all this is happening, what's going on, and whatnot. So
And if you're interested in signing up for that MacArthur report, it comes out quarterly. And you can go to our website, www.macarthurmemorial.org, and there will be a button on the front page that you can use to sign up for that MacArthur report. So thank you, Jim, as always, for all of your expertise.
thank you. See you later.